Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. I thought this evening I would talk some general terms about meditation, and particularly our attitude towards meditation and the aims and purposes. I think it's one of the major misconceptions or stumbling blocks that people have, is often to be goal oriented in the meditation, particularly if they've got some background in the study of the theory, and they talk about jhanas and breakthroughs and almost as like keeping a scorecard. And the attitude becomes attempting to attain something, and that language is used to attain to jhana, for example. You hear that, or to gain something, to go somewhere. And this is not only misleading, but I think it's counterproductive. That attitude has been called spiritual materialism. These theoretical schemes of the stages of insight, the stages of awakening, and the jhanas, they're useful and they're true. They actually point to something real. But it's a misapprehension to take them as something to be gained, like a prize, or something very exotic, brand new state of consciousness. Whereas a better, more useful, and actually I think closer to the truth attitude of thinking about the path is to think of it in terms of a purification and simplification, and attempting to experience a more natural or more primordial state of mind. This is at least in part what the Zen koan is pointing to, that asks, what was your face before you were born? The ordinary state of consciousness, the day-to-day worldly consciousness, is actually a very complex one. It's very busy. There's a lot going on, and there's constant processing of sense data and of thought forms, and then there's emotional reactions to things, and all of this has the power to overwhelm and bewilder the mind. When we sit down to meditate, what we're fundamentally doing is simplifying the stream of consciousness. And this is true, I think, for any form of meditation. I think it's true for samatha and for vipassana as well, perhaps in a somewhat different way or a different approach, but this rule applies, that we're working towards a more natural, simple state of mind. To deal with the case of samadhi and samatha meditation, the whole structure of the meditation is one of simplification, in that you're attempting to stabilize the mind on a single object. That's the meaning of samadhi, is stability or stillness. You're trying to make the mind steady, whereas the mind that is engaged in multiple objects is confused and changing all the time, changeable and very complex, very complicated, very, very dense knot. The very opening lines of the Visuddhimagga are, who shall untangle this tangle? That the ordinary state of mind is very tangled. And by simplifying this tangle, by resting on a single object and practicing the skill of non-attention to all the other objects that intrude on the mind, then the mind becomes, with the stillness comes peacefulness, calm, ease. And what principally stands against that effort are the 5 nivaranas, the hindrances. That's a list of mental states specifically given by the Buddha as referencing obstacles to meditation, obstacles to samadhi. And those, of course, are sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, anxiety, and skeptical doubt. And as long as those are present in the mind to any degree, the mind won't settle into jhana. But the corollary of that, very important and promising, is that if those hindrances are not present in the mind, if they're made quiescent, if they're not intruding on the mind, then there will be a natural deepening of samadhi. That's where the mind goes, because it's a more natural state of mind. It's a mind not burdened. It's not complicated with all this extraneous stuff. It's returning to its true nature. It's settling into that. And it's not like a striving. It just goes there naturally when the hindrances are not present. The hindrances are the obstacle that keeps the mind in a state of complexity. So the first effort should be to know when the hindrances are arising, and then not to validate them or support them, but attempt to diminish them. And the mind will then very naturally deepen in its samadhi. Samadhi is a jhana. It's a state when the mind has attained some degree of perfection of samadhi, that there's stillness and the hindrances are not present. They're made quiescent. They're still, they're not intruding on the mind. And when we look at the scheme of the 4 jhanas, we're looking at a scheme of increasing simplicity, increasing purity. That the mind is not gaining anything anywhere along, but is shedding layers and uncovering what's naturally present, the natural, ordinary state of mind. So in first jhana, which is the lowest of the jhanas, so it's therefore the most complex, although it's greatly more simple than sense consciousness, ordinary day-to-day consciousness. It's still relatively complex compared to the others because it has 5 factors. There's vitakka, vichara, applied and sustained thought, piti and sukha, rapture and bliss, and ekaggata, unity of mind. There's a separation from not only from sense desire, but from senses, from sense experience. It becomes much less, it may not be completely absent, but it's very, very attenuated, very much less in first jhana. But sense experience is that which is just outside the door. It's the thing that's left behind most recently. So there's a saying that sound is a thorn to first jhana, because a loud or sharp sound, if someone is not really stable in their jhana, a loud or sharp sound can disturb the mind enough and bring it back to the senses and fall from the state of jhana. So it's just left the senses behind. But there's still, because of Vitakka Vichara, there's still some element of thought formation present. But then the further purification is second jhana, is the fading away of thought formation. So Vitakka Vichara not present, so we're now down to the three factors of piti, sukha, and ekaggata. So it's simpler. And notice that nothing new has been added to the mind. Now the senses are very far away, they're not troublesome at all, but thought formation is that which is just outside the gate, so to speak. So if the mind is drawn to the temptation of thinking, pondering, then it'll fall from second jhana. In third jhana, piti falls away, so there's only bliss and unity of mind. The difference between piti and sukha is that piti is a more energetic type of happiness. They're both mental states, but piti has strong associations with the body, that there'll be bodily sensations of tingling or rushing or a subjective feeling of levitating. It's called uplifting piti. Sukha has no real correlate in the body. It's just a steady, blissful happiness. The only association with the body is that the body feels completely at ease, no distress in the body. So third jhana is sukha and ekaggata. And then fourth jhana, sukha is replaced by upekkha, equanimity, which at that level is experienced as a profound peacefulness, poetically called the bliss beyond bliss, sukham param sukham. So in all this movement from the sense desire ordinary consciousness to fourth jhana, we're just dropping things away. The piti and sukha are there ready to be experienced at all times, but we suppress them with the hindrances and with our busyness and our worries and our desires and our fears and so on. We keep a lid on that natural expression. There's also a cosmological or mythological analog to this idea of the jhana states being natural or primordial, in that the human race originated from Abhasara Brahmas falling down to the material plane, Abhasara Brahmas being second jhana level beings. In the mythology, that's where we came from. We came from Abhasara Brahma beings. So going into deep samadhi is essentially remembering a state that we've forgotten. It's remembering what we had long ago. And I think the same sort of approach of seeing progress as simplification, purification, applies also to the Vipassana path. In that as you're looking at objects of mind, which is what Vipassana is being consciously aware of the stream of objects that pass before the mind, To begin with, this stream is very bewildering because of its innate complexity. Objects arising at the sense doors or arising in the mind in terms of memory or thought or fantasy. All these things are bombarding the mind, and the meditator can feel overwhelmed and confused. I've found in teaching meditation that very often if someone does their first retreat focusing on Vipassana, and they're spending a lot of time or all day doing Vipassana meditation, it's very common for them around the third or fourth day to come and tell me that they think they're going crazy. I think I'm going mad. And because what's happening is they're seeing the actual ordinary stream of consciousness clearly for the first time. Like one meditator expressed it, which I think was a really good analogy. She said, it's like there's half a dozen radio receivers in my cabin, and they're all fading in and out of different stations, and sometimes it's static, and sometimes it's music, and sometimes it's voice, and they're all going at once at different things. That's her analogy of how her mind felt. And that's why, if we don't meditate, and I was saying to somebody this morning, I find it difficult to understand how people can manage to get through life without meditating. Without meditating, you're just caught in that cacophony of miscellaneous radio stations coming in and out all the time. So no wonder people are anxious and confused and wandering without a purpose. But the Vipassana is a medicine for that. By making the process conscious, you begin to make it still or quiet. It becomes less of a cacophony and more of a clearly observed stream of objects. And for a time, there's still, troublesome thoughts and pains and odd bits of imagination intruding on the mind, but you're taking it one at a time and seeing it clearly. And if you're doing it properly, you're not feeding it any energy by becoming interested in it or fearful of it or desirous of it, but you're just neutrally observing it. And without being fed that energy, the process becomes more quiescent naturally. And the mind begins to simplify. And after what may be sometimes a difficult passage up and down, you at last come to a state that is called equanimity about formations, which is the last state of mind attainable by striving. It's not yet awakening, but it's the jumping off place. It's the landing strip. It's where awakening can happen. And it's called equanimity about formations because, again, as in fourth jhana, upekkha is the dominant characteristic. There's a very profound peacefulness and an equanimity. The process of taking objects continues. It has not yet ceased, but it's very quiet, and the mind is not disturbed by it. The mind is restful. There's no sense when one is in that state, there's no sense of putting in an effort. Although the meditation is flawless, there's no sense of putting in an effort. There's no sense even of meditating, really. It's just sitting there and being aware of stream of consciousness. And what can happen from that position of mind is the ultimate simplification, which is the realization of the unconditioned. And that's not something that you can do or make happen. It's a natural a result of the diminishment of engagement with the process of samsara, which occurs with deep vipassana and equanimity of formations. The attachment to the process of desiring objects, taking objects, feeling unsatisfied and wanting another object, that process, which is the essence of samsara at its simplest form, and it's sort of the level of the nuts and bolts. That's what we're doing. We're taking an object, it dissatisfies us, so we desire another object. That begins to peter out and become attenuated, and eventually the force behind that process becomes so weak that the mind's able to slip sideways, as it were, out of the groove and realize the unconditioned, which is the ultimate simplification and purification. And nibbana is not some place out there, some magical state. It's when we stop doing samsara. It's just as jhana is when you stop doing sense level consciousness. The mind naturally settles into jhana. So when you take that a step further, you stop doing samsara altogether, then what's left is nibbana. And you can think of that too as a primordial state, even though we have to be careful we're not imposing the idea of time on nibbana. It's not primordial in the sense of being original or ancient. It's primordial in the sense of being ultimately basic. It's outside of time. Time doesn't apply. Before and after doesn't apply. Those are all aspects of samsaric becoming, which is, as I said, very complicated. Whereas nibbana is the ultimately simple, the ultimately pure. When we talk about states of consciousness, and using the Abhidhamma model of 4 levels of consciousness: sense desire consciousness, form consciousness, formless, and nibbana, it's often presented or put forth in tables and things in a vertical hierarchy. But I'd like to suggest another metaphor to think about it. As long as you understand it's just a metaphor, not to be taken literally, to think of it as concentric circles, like a bullseye, with nibbana at the center, and then the formless states, boundless space, boundless consciousness, nothingness, neither perception or non-perception. Outside of that, so the state of neither perception or non-perception is samsara at a bare minimum, the very least samsaric state that's still within condition. So as you go outwards from the center, you're becoming further from that pristine simplicity. You're becoming more complex. There's more factors. There's stuff added on as we go outwards. So you go out through the realms of form, which are the jhanas, and finally you go out. The very periphery is the sense desire consciousness. And that's most complex in many ways, including the fact that it's the most variegated. You have a wide range of possibilities within sense desire consciousness, from the hell realms to the animals, to humans, to devas. And everything within those realms has many varieties. Whereas the closer you get to the center, the more simple, the less divergence, the less complexity. So So when we're meditating, we're trying to move closer to the center of that bullseye. So that's one metaphor that may be useful. Another is the one in the Visuddhimagga, you're untangling the tangle. And working with that metaphor, untangling the tangle, it's from a completely different tradition and source, but it makes me think of the legend of Gordian's knot. Somewhere in Asia Minor, there was this complicated knot that some wizard or philosopher or somebody in ancient times had tied this really complex knot, and it was a challenge to everybody to come along and try and unsolve the knot. And for generations, they'd been pulling at this bit and that bit. And then Alexander the Great comes along and he asks, "What's the problem here?" And they explain it to him. He says, "Oh, that's nothing." And he pulls out his sword and cuts it through. And that sword, you can take that if you want to take the imagery from that story. The sword is the clear wisdom mind of Vipassana. Instead of following the tangles of the knot and getting deeper into the mess, you cut through it. You see the emptiness of it. There's a reason why in the Mahayana tradition, Manjusri, the Bodhisattva of wisdom, is always depicted wielding a sword. The usual image of Manjusri's got a book open in his lap in one hand and a sword over his head in the other hand. You know that cutting through is the is the way with of Vipassana. It's not trying to untangle the knot and just get yourself caught in it. It's to cut through. You know? So I'll stop there.